Many modern societies are characterized by complex social hierarchies and a state that collects taxes to fund the provision of public goods. This structure traces back to the Neolithic Revolution. While the prehistoric period was mainly populated by small, egalitarian groups of hunter-gatherers, the transition to sedentary farming led to the emergence of complex hierarchies and states. This raises a number of long-standing questions. What mechanism links the adoption of agriculture to the origin of the state? And why did states emerge in some regions but not others? Stretching back to Adam Smith and even earlier, the prevailing answer has been that complex hierarchies resulted from increased food output. Farming generated a surplus, which was a prerequisite for the rise of a tax-levying elite and the emergence of classes who did not themselves produce food. According to this view, differences in land productivity explain regional disparities in the development of states. This paper challenges that theory and argues that it was not an increase in food production that gave rise to the state, but rather the transition to reliance on cereal grains. Cereals are easily stored, and, because they are harvested seasonally, have to be stored in order to provide year-round subsistence. This makes them highly appropriable. Stored cereals can be easily confiscated and transported to support a taxing elite. Compare this to roots and tubers, which don't have to be reaped seasonally and are fairly perishable once harvested. These crops are difficult to confiscate and nearly impossible to transport for distant use, making it unlikely that complex hierarchies would emerge in societies that cultivate them. Indeed, in many regions where the adoption of agriculture did not lead to the emergence of states, the staple crops were roots and tubers rather than cereals. So the authors argue that appropriability, rather than productivity, is the key mechanism for state formation. Because stored cereals are appropriable by both a would-be elite and by bandits, their cultivation simultaneously generates a demand for protection and provides the means by which that protection can be financed via taxation. As such, when it became possible to appropriate crops, a taxing elite emerged, and this led to the state. It follows from this theory that a region's suitability for cultivating cereals, rather than its agricultural productivity per se, is the key determinant for whether hierarchy emerges. The authors test this assertion using several datasets stretching back through human history. The first provides a snapshot of over 1,200 pre-industrial societies, primarily in the 18th and 19th centuries, and records both their level of hierarchical complexity and the major crop cultivated. This is combined with data on potential crop yields, which is used to measure land productivity and to identify areas where cereal cultivation is naturally advantageous. Consistent with the appropriability theory, societies that cultivate cereals because their climate and geography are advantageous for doing so have higher levels of hierarchical complexity. There is no positive effect of land productivity on hierarchy, and societies based on roots and tubers display similar levels of hierarchy to non-farming societies. Moving further back in history, a second dataset tracks hierarchical complexity based on the boundaries of 159 modern-day countries and measured every half-century from AD 50 to 2000. Here, we see which regions were organized as states in AD 450, just before the collapse of the Roman Empire. State presence closely tracks the geographic distribution of wild relatives of domesticated cereals. These are wild plants that are genetically related to cultivated crops, and their presence serves as a proxy for domestication. Regions that were organized as states in AD 450 are characterized by the presence of several wild relatives of cereals and none of roots and tubers. In other words, states are found in areas where agriculture was more likely to start with cereals. Both land productivity and the presence of wild relatives of roots and tubers are uncorrelated with state presence. Evidence from the Columbian exchange of crops between the New and Old Worlds is also consistent with the appropriability theory. The exchange permanently altered land productivity and the productivity advantage of cereals in many regions, but only these changes had an impact on hierarchical complexity. Moving closer to the Neolithic transition, the third set of data tracks the locations of ancient cities. Indications of early civilization are concentrated in areas where agriculture was likely to start with cereals. Adding data on centers of crop domestication further reveals that proximity to a center only had a positive effect on urbanization if that center domesticated cereals. Finally, the authors zero in on the Neolithic transition with a database of radiocarbon-dated prehistoric sites. They count the number of pre- and post-Neolithic sites in each region, and find that the Neolithic transition only led to greater indication of complex hierarchies in places where agriculture likely started with cereals. In these data as well, there is no evidence for the conventional productivity theory. Thus, multiple tests show that cereal cultivation has a causal effect on the emergence of complex hierarchies, while there is no independent effect of land productivity. This is consistent with the idea that appropriability is the key mechanism for state formation. These results shed new light on the origin of the state and on modern patterns of low state capacity and underdevelopment. To read more on this topic, you can check out the paper's references to other related work. This includes research on the origin of the state, the long-term impact of pre-colonial institutions, and the links between state capacity and economic development.